Hello, good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait for another minute and let everybody join in. Hopefully there are more people coming in, and then we'll start the session today. All right, I think we can start the session. Is everyone okay with that? Yep, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasleen, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Manna Institute. And today I will be moderating our webinar, our March webinar. But before we delve into the webinar, I just want to do the acknowledgement to the country. Manna Institute respectfully acknowledges the First Nation peoples as the continuing custodians of this continent, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. The Institute honors their rich cultural heritage, beliefs, and enduring relationship to the lands and communities in which we all live, learn, and work. Today, I'm coming to you from the Wurundjeri country, and please feel free to mention where you're joining us today in the chat. As you may be aware, and this is for our new viewers today, Manna Institute is a virtual institute which is formed by Regional University Network, also known as RUN, which is made up of 7 universities that are University of New England, Federation University, CQU, Charles Sturt University, Southern Cross University, University of Sunshine Coast, and University of Southern Queensland. Our foundation partners are EveryMind, Lifeline Direct, Lifeline Research Foundation, and Center for Mental Health Research at ANU. At Manna Institute, we have some of the leading researchers and industry partners who are working with the rural, regional, and remote Australian communities to improve their mental health and well-being. So Manna supports meaningful research, fosters the development of professional workforces, and translates research findings into practical, place-based programs. If you have been joining our webinars previously, you will notice that today's webinar is a bit different, but in a good way. Today's webinar is more of a conversation that delves into a very important topic of disability and inclusion. And joining us today for this conversation are Professor Jennifer Smith-Mary and Associate Professor Sarah Wayland. Now, Jen Smith-Mary is Professor of Health and Social Policy and Australian Research Council Industry Laureate Fellow from 2023 to 2028 in the University of Sydney School of Health Sciences. Jen is the Director of the Centre of Disability Research and Policy, a multidisciplinary centre whose mission is to make life better for people with disability, but by translating research to policy and practice. Her research focuses on disability and mental health policy, particularly in relation to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or NDIS. She works closely with people with lived experiences of disability and has a strong interest in critical theoretical approaches of policy analysis. Sarah Wayland is Associate Professor of Social Work at University of New England and our very own Research Fellow at the Manna Institute. Now, I would like to invite Sarah to tell us more about her research expertise and start the conversation on disability and inclusion. Welcome, Sarah and Jen.
Thanks, Jasleen. It's really lovely to be here today, not in the moderator space, but I'm actually just here to help facilitate a conversation with probably one of the most interesting and entertaining people that I know, Professor Jen Smith-Mary. And just as a background, Jen gave me my very first job after I finished my PhD, a little over 10 years ago, I think, even though we still look a lot younger than that. But I think that that's always a really important person in anyone's academic journey as you move from PhD candidate to ECR. So the conversation that Jen and I are going to have today is under that broader umbrella of disability inclusion and understanding policy and program delivery, with some opportunities for that kind of broader exploration, but also then narrowing it down to regional, rural, remote, given that's what we're here for from Manna Institute's perspective. But I think one of the first places to start is always to understand what the person who works in the space and is very passionate and energetic working in the space is thinking about, is for Jen to give us an overview about what some of the challenges and I guess wins have been in her career, so that it kind of shapes our conversation. So Jen, tell us a little bit about you before we talk more about NDIS and psychosocial disability.
Yeah, so I start by just talking about, well, where I came from in terms of research. So I actually got an undergraduate degree in medieval women's religious history, which is not where you'd normally start when you're after a career in disability policy. However, I decided pragmatically that after doing honours in that, I wanted to actually do something that was going to be useful to address some of the social problems that I'd seen just in the work that I was doing while I was a student, which was working as an aged carer in an aged care facility and seeing some of the issues related to resourcing and people's access to services within that context, both good and bad. So I decided that I was interested in policy, like how do decisions that are made at a high level in policy end up impacting people on the ground in unexpected ways. So, for example, I was a very sort of menial worker in a dining room, and I was asked to cut the amount of bread that we put on residents' tables, for example, because there was overall budget cuts and they were linked to things that were beyond the facility that I worked in. So I think that question still remains really key to the research that I do in disability policy, and that is how do the experiences of people who are receiving services impact policy? So how do we get that connection to happen? And then I also started to think about, well, how do policy decisions that are seemingly rational and get so messed up on the way to being implemented? So that's been something that I've carried on through my career. I think the other thing is that because I did my PhD, actually, and it was in a school of social work, so it was a school of social work and social policy. But social policy in Australia does not have a very big, I suppose, academic, like there's people around that are social policy experts, but it's mainly linked to social work. So you don't normally ever get a social policy job that sits outside of social work. And professors of social policy, because they sit in the social work department, they will always have to have a social work degree to work in that area. So that meant that my career has mainly been in health, and that's because that offers me a way to progress through my career. What it's meant being a policy person in health has been really beneficial in that I'm not sort of stuck in a profession. What's problematic is that also I don't have like a natural home to be part of like an academic community. So it's almost like I found this academic community of odd bods, such as yourself, Sarah, that are interested in complex problems and looking at them from different dimensions. That's actually really good for solving complex problems, but it means that sometimes it's difficult to find your academic home.
And so, like, just want to understand that a bit more, because we often hear from people that they feel like they don't have a gang or a team around them, and that often bringing people together is sometimes exactly like you said about, oh, well, we're the same discipline or we're the same profession, therefore we come together and then we utilize these research areas to get where we want to go, rather than taking the research area and then seeing it from, it's not even a multidisciplinary perspective, is it? It's like, well, the professional term wouldn't be an odd bod perspective, but it's like the potpourri approach to like bringing like-minded people together for the greater good. I often think that that's the core of when we talk about wicked problems, that wicked problems are solved by randoms coming together that have a string that connects them, but not necessarily by title or location or background, but a commitment to the bigger picture.
I think absolutely right. Like, so I think that commitment to a bigger picture, having this bigger, having a set of values or an interest that is beyond your profession. Because if you're just sort of tied to your profession, then that actually limits the possibilities of where you can go with something. So I think institutes like the Manna Institute, which bring together people around a particular topic, people with energy and passion and like a deep understanding of a particular area, or the interest in getting a deep understanding of a particular area, I think that trumps everything for me.
Yeah.
So in terms of the way that my colleagues and I work together with in the Centre for Disability Research and Policy, it's people who have energy, people who have real interest. That's where we get things done. Yep. Not the people that are the professor of a profession and they've worked their way through a professional society to get where they want to go.
So before we talk about NDIS a little bit further, can you give us an overview around CDRP, so the Centre for Disability Research and Policy within University of Sydney, about what brings all of those kind of disparate people together in terms of like, what's the big goal of the centre? Like, do you have a big goal, or is it based on what the emerging interests are and where you head to?
I think definitely like an overall goal is that we that we understand the inequity that faces people with disability just based on the fact that you have a disability, you acquire a disability, you're born with a disability. So we think that society should be inclusive of people with disability. Beyond that, we really come together around issues that emerge and that we have interest and knowledge in. So some of the main areas, so that means that we welcome anyone with an interest in disability, and working at the University of Sydney, I'm in a school that has mainly professions. So most of those professions are actually about disability. So they're about physiotherapy, OT, there's a lot of speech pathology. They're all about, a lot of them, they're about disability. You could say they're about disability, but the people in them aren't necessarily thinking in terms of disability. They're not thinking about addressing that social, the social context of disability, making society more broadly inclusive of people with disability, because they're focused on prevention of disability or assessment or things like that. So they don't necessarily have a disability focus, but when they do, then they're welcome to being part of the centre.
And I really love that kind of switching the narrative a little bit around when we work in a particular population group. If we step into the space as a profession, then that almost becomes the primary focus of that rehabilitation model or the recovery model of what we do, rather than looking at the person in their environment, which is a very social worky thing to say, but very much from that social policy perspective, that's understanding not just the person has a disability, but how disabling the environment can be, and that both of those spaces come together to create almost the perfect storm a lot of the time for access and inclusion. So I can remember really vividly, and it's not just because I'm a redhead, but when Julia Gillard announced the creation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the National Disability Insurance Agency, and that the focus was very much on, those kind of catchphrases, wasn't it, around that this is about choice and control, This is about giving space and opportunity back to people with disability to decide what they needed to live a meaningful life, which I always think is such a loaded term because it's such an ableist term within itself around what we think is normal and what people should aspire to be like. But the challenge I've always had, and I know that we could talk about this for hours, has always been around NDIS and psychosocial disability, that we would most commonly call living with a mental illness or complex mental health, is that the purpose of NDIS around disability has been about those people living with lifelong disability, yet the narrative around mental health, and it's something we talk about at Manna, is that mental health is a fluctuating, situational, intergenerational, peaks and troughs life experience for a lot of people, and that it doesn't all just fit neatly within a recovery-oriented model. Not everybody gets better, and not everybody wants to get better, because I know people I've spoken to don't want to go back to how they were before they were getting help, but that the new normal is the space they need support with. So if you think about what would be really great to hear from you is about that work that you've done on the intersection of NDIS and psychosocial disability and what you've learned from that space.
Yeah, and I think that the number one thing is this issue about the NDIS has a very strong permanence criteria. So the criteria is lifelong disability, as you said. That's unlike, I think, access to almost any other sort of disability support that we have. So within the education system, within the disability support pension, I think that it's permanence means 2 years, I think, within that disability support pension. So almost every other legislative or regulatory definition that we have of disability does not have lifelong in it. So then as someone with a mental illness who might have fluctuating needs, you're able to access disability support. However, to access the NDIS, you have to say, I'm going to have, I have a disabling mental illness and I'm going to have this disability for the rest of my life. And that's what that has meant is that, I mean, I'm sighing because I was just listening to a podcast before I joined today, and it was the George Teleporis Reasonable and Necessary podcast that he does, which is a YouTube. And there was someone speaking in that, and I don't know whether I just misinterpreted them, but they were saying something like, with they've got this new idea that you go on to early intervention or like the foundational supports before you were able to enter the scheme in full. But she was basically saying that people, why would they have to go through this phase and get assessed all the time? Because we know that they're just, if you've got a disability, by that point, you're just going to have it for the rest of your life anyway, if you've got a psychosocial disability. And that just made me really frustrated, because what the whole narrative has changed to make psychosocial disability fit within this scheme where permanence is the criteria. And that really, and it means that people, because of the scheme is under threat now, people are hanging really tightly to this idea that psychosocial is no different to every other type of disability. So people are going to have it for life. So they should be in the scheme for their lifetime. And that's not the message that I want to get out there. What I want to get out is the scheme needs to be much more flexible and address people who are going to have lifelong disability that never changes, but also people who are going to need intensive supports of the kind that is offered by the NDIS for periods of time, move off it, move back on, according to what their needs are. And that is, it's becoming, people are not having that discussion so much anymore.
But Jen, how do you, and I don't mean you, I kind of mean the sector, but how do you reason with the idea that the evidence base around working with people with complex mental health conditions is about recognising the role of recovery narratives, and not recovering to who you were, but recovering to what makes life easier, for want of a better word, for you? How does policy get created for NDIS and other types of schemes that almost works in opposition to what the evidence base actually says. Like, how does that kind of evidence base to policy development to program delivery pipeline happen in such a weird way?
Well, I think it's because people try to use a narrative that makes this group of people fit within this NDIS that doesn't fit very well.
Yeah.
So it's like, so Sarah and I, when we first started working, we were working on a project that was funded by Partners in Recovery, which was a scheme for people with serious and complex mental illness. Now, that scheme was rolled out across the country under the Gillard government as well. And it provided individual supports to meet people's psychosocial needs, but mainly their social functioning needs. It was very flexible and it had a low bar to entry. So people had to have serious mental illness, but they didn't need to have like a diagnosis written in stone or anything like that. That scheme was evaluated really well, but it lost its funding because of the advent of the NDIS. So, but what we found was that actually only about 50% of that group of people were able to access the NDIS and become NDIS participants. And that meant that because it lost its funding, that scheme went, and those people that couldn't access the NDIS were not left with any of those types of supports anymore, because those supports weren't there. And so therefore, the recovery narrative, which was super, super strong within Partners in Recovery, was focused on recovery.
They kept on brand very well.
Yeah, they kept on brand. That meant that the sector was desperate to get that group of people still getting support. So what they tried to do then was to get those people to create a narrative about their mental ill health that then allowed them access to the NDIS. And that's what it is. It's just like you're trying to fit this group of people into a scheme that does not really fit them, but you're so desperate to get them in.
Yeah. And what's always been really interesting when you engage in the community with people with disability or carers of people with disability is that NDIS has created a whole population of people who have had to learn the skills of how to engage with NDIS rather than engaging with NDIS because of their disability, understanding how to do the assessment, understanding what to put on documentation, understanding what reports to have written and what they need to say in order to get into the system, rather than who they are, allowing them to just get into the system naturally.
Yeah, and I mean that's a really good example, because it's not only individuals, it's like a whole industry that is trying to get people into this. I mean, apart from individuals who are able to access allied health that can support them to get into it, but we evaluated a program that was funded by the state government in order to get people who are homeless into the NDIS. And that's a group that finds it very difficult to get into the NDIS, even though they probably absolutely need the NDIS far more than other groups. And it's because they don't interact in the right ways with the scheme. They don't have the right paperwork, often don't have any paperwork. They don't have consistency of access to services. So this was a program that was deliberately there so that people who are experts in the language of the NDIS could work with individuals to get all of those things together and get them onto the NDIS. And that's just ridiculous, really.
It's bananas when you think about it, that you have to create a system that teaches people how to engage with the system. And all of that talks to the people who get left behind. And I think, everything that we do in Manna acknowledges the need to not be metrocentric in the work that we do, to not take what works in the city and naturally apply it to regional, rural, remote and hope that it works, and not to utilize the evidence base all of the time that talks about what it means when you've got 3 options for allied health within 5 kilometres of your home is very different than having to drive 6 hours to get basic kind of primary health care. So if we think about, you know, this kind of left behind narrative of what happens in disability inclusion, what have you learnt in your career around what that means in regional, rural, remote?
I think what it means, I mean, the cause is exactly what you think. We have this idea that we have this sort of, I think it's an unsaid narrative that runs underneath our policy, which is that if you choose to live in rural and remote areas, you're choosing to receive less services. And that's your choice. There's not something that governments have to deal with. If you actually wanted to get services, then you would not be in those areas. And I think that, you know, I've heard people actually say that, people who are well educated and should be on top of things, seemingly left-wing types of people will make that statement. And so I think that actually underpins a lot of that, a lot of the policy is this assumption that, well, people don't actually, they're choosing to do that. And therefore we don't have to make policy for people that are choosing to make a lifestyle decision to not live in a metropolitan centre. I don't agree with that, obviously. So I think that our policies then are made not really thinking about that group of people.
Yeah.
I think that I think in terms of how we address that, that's the big problem. So trying to because I think our systems have been built up so much around a metrocentric view of the way that services operate. And the NDIS is absolutely the prime example of that. Why create a market-driven model when anyone could have known right from the start that you were not going to get markets in a huge area of Australia? And simply talking about the need for the NDIS to be the provider of last resort doesn't mean that that's going to happen. And actually, it's never happened. They've never actually implemented that. They've never addressed thin markets in that type of way.
So there's no, and some of these questions I'm not anticipating that you'll be able to ask, you know, the beer and knower of everything. But has there been work done around, are there incentives to ensure that the market is spread across geographic locations? Or is it that the market turns up where the market turns up, which invariably will be in metropolitan cities?
Yeah, I don't think there has been any attempt, because there's this idea that you don't mess with the market, that the market will emerge if there's a need. Sometimes it does emerge if there's a need, but it often emerges at the lowest common denominator level. So you get so people who have sort of low specialist needs might be able to receive services, and that's because the services that they need can just be provided by anyone with an ABN. They don't even have to be registered or anything like that. But if you've got specialist needs because of your cultural needs, or if you've got specialist mental health related needs or behavioral support needs, then those are not going to be met. So what you get is this inequity where among people with disability, where some people with disability might be receiving services in rural and remote areas, but those that have more specialist needs do not receive that. So it means that people that already have maybe more severe disability or more severe psychosocial needs end up missing out further. So you get this growing disparity between or amongst people with disability as well.
So because that intersection of NDIS and psychosocial disability is already a hard barrier to kind of leap over, the impact of geographic isolation is also an additional barrier, given that the market's not there, which means that people in regional, rural, remote will be less likely to engage with a program that's supposed to be there to increase their choice and control.
Yeah, like I think you just get this layering of disadvantage. I mean,
Yeah.
people talk about intersectionality, but I think intersectionality is just like a bleh term, but
Yeah.
it actually is this layering
Yeah.
of like more, you just get more and more disadvantaged, and
Yeah.
rural and remote is a really significant form of disadvantage when it
Yeah.
comes to disability and particular forms of disability.
So before we get to the part where I want to hear your policy wish list, particularly with all the Manna people here with their ears kind of like sparked and ready to go with solving complex issues, is that one of the things that I've always admired from CDRP working in it and standing outside and supporting it is the complete focus on lived experience inclusion in your academic workforce, as well as in the ways in which you do your work. So I guess I just wanted to get a sense from you around what does lived experience inclusion mean from an academic perspective, and what have been CDRP's learnings and your learnings over the years around not just doing work out in the community that's inclusive and accessible, but really making sure that the workforce itself is representative of the community that it's working with.
I think that I think you have to put thought into it. So I think that you have to take a strategic approach to having a wider workforce. So the reasons for doing it are that your research is going to be more relevant if it connects with the community and the experiences of people in the community, that it's going to be more effective in terms of actually reaching, bridging that connection between knowledge on the ground and government that I was talking about earlier on.
Yep.
And it's going to, research is actually set up in a way that stops people with lived experience becoming researchers. So we've got a whole system that has excluded that group because academics have thought that they are the ones that address their problems on their behalf or solve problems on their behalf. And so I think we've had to be really. I used to think, oh well, I'll just employ as many people with disability as I can.
Yeah.
Which is a good starting point.
Yeah.
Or just include people as much as I can.
Yeah.
But then you think, well, what am I including people to do? I'm including people so that they just are employed to collect data on my project. But that's not giving people a career. We're not developing a career. We're still creating this situation where we've got people who don't have disability or who don't live in rural areas sitting at the top of a project and then just bringing in knowledge where we can.
Yeah.
So in terms of being strategic, you need to think about how am I going to make a situation where in the future those people can be leading projects of their own. So in order to do that, you have to think, okay, who's out there already? Is there someone that I can, parachute up to the top? If I want to do that, how do I work with the university administration to try and work out whether there's a position for that person? Can we work with philanthropy in order to say there's a named chair that we're going to provide to that person? Because often when it comes to open recruitment, the university still operates in this, how many publications have you got? How many grants have you got? Like what's been your rate of output over this time period? All of that type of thing.
Yeah.
So I think you have to be really strategic in trying to build careers, trying to work strategically within the university. Something I do at the University of Sydney is always tell it how great it's doing. So you're going to be the world leader in disability-led research and teaching.
Yeah.
We're already on the way. We're going to be the world leader. And they'll be like, oh, that's great. Yeah, we're going to be
Are we? Awesome.
Exactly. Okay, we'll keep working on that and then we'll tell everyone about it. So, I think, you have to be very strategic about that.
And part of that, isn't it, Jen, you know, and something that we've been attempting and are doing in Manna is leveraging that period between lived experience PhD students and then ensuring that there's a pipeline then for ECR, so becoming early career researchers. Because first of all, it's very difficult in this climate to go from PhD to an academic career.
Yeah.
There's things that you can overtly do, can't you, within the PhD process that sets up the opportunity to step into those positions with, you know, to play the game of the academy in terms of publications, smaller grants, teaching opportunities, all of those things that allow people to demonstrate that it's not their disability that they're being included for, but that their lived experience research skills that is not just dependent on them having lived experience is kind of the hero of the story. So, yeah, I don't think there's a question in that. I think I was just trying to muddle through in my head about what I keep thinking about how disabling it can be to do a PhD at a university level just because of all of the hoops that you have to jump through, you know, software systems not being vision accessible, not always having transcription services in places that you need to have them, like all of those sorts of things send subtle, obvious messages to people if you're not included here. So it's always about thinking about all of those layers, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And also you need to be fighting alongside people to fight those battles.
Yeah.
We've employed people with lived experience of disability who need additional supports. A lot of people don't need additional supports as well. So, and the university just keeps rediscovering that these people are within the university over and over again. There's nothing structured there. If I go online and say, okay, this, you go to appoint someone and it says you can tick a box saying, is this person have disability? That box doesn't go anywhere. Like it's just something that you tick on the form. No one checks it. Like, and, you can raise that again and again and again, and it just doesn't get done. And those types of, like, you need to actually have someone who's going to sort of sit alongside that person who can help fight the battles, because you can't do that yourself. It's just soul destroying. Why would you put yourself in that situation and join a university that doesn't even think about you at all?
Exactly. And I think that that's persistent across all of the universities I've been at. And I think that point of sitting beside people, it's not mentoring people, it's not being their like kind of support person, but it's about recognizing that in order to remind people that it's not just as simple as a desk modification to increase disability participation, that we need to think beyond that, and that it should just be about like where we go for Christmas lunches and is that accessible for people. Like all of the things that we do has to come with that accessibility lens. Okay, so before we kind of switch over to hearing from people, and I can see that the chat's been going while we've been talking, is, what you know about Manna in terms of our focus across the 7 universities and with our partner orgs, and the role of really placing a spotlight on what regional mental health needs are. What do you think we can learn from your work that you've done in CDRP? What do we need to be thinking about in terms of where we can value add from a regional perspective around mental health? From a policy or from a research perspective?
I think bringing them both together, I think that one of the areas that I've done a little bit of work in is support for people with very, very complex needs. So, and regional communities actually often do that a bit better than they do in metro areas. And that's because people know people. Sometimes it just doesn't work at all. Like they know people and they don't want anything to do with them. But it's like,
know them but hate them. All good. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's right. They're known, but they're just like, oh, that's that person with their complex needs. We're not going to deal with them. But where it works well, then there's much more of an ability to have sort of joined up systems around the individual, or someone to go, okay, well, you know, we're chatting and we're talking about this person and their needs. So we know them, and so this is how we're going to address them, because we know our community and the supports that are available for this person. So I think that in terms of complexity, that works really well. But why I'm mentioning complexity is that something like the NDIS and psychosocial disability, it doesn't really handle complexity very well. And that's because the NDIS in particular is a very tightly bound, regulated system in that it only covers certain supports, whereas other supports that sit around it can be a little bit more flexible. But the way that support coordination is in the NDIS at the moment doesn't do a really good job at connecting things for people. So people often get stuck in situations. So in rural areas, I think that there's something where it's working well, there's a model that you can then try and apply to, so you can look at the value add of rural and regional communities rather than just see the problems that come from the barriers of location and a lack of resources and systems that are not set up in relation to their needs. But often people with complex needs are not receiving services within rural and regional communities as well. So when we evaluated a complex needs add-on, a lot of which the New South Wales government ran for the NDIS, a lot of people that were in that scheme were located in rural and regional areas. They were not getting the services they need, and the services were not coming together around them because there was just a lack of any available services that would meet their needs. And yet they didn't want to move people out of their communities, obviously, to access services.
And I think, Jen, I was also thinking that from a complex care perspective, this isn't just about people living with psychosocial disability and having complex needs, but people with disability with complex needs, that the lack of service delivery or coordination or policy that actually responds to their needs can lead to psychological distress as well. So it also creates an additional health-related condition because of the lack of service delivery, particularly in the regions.
Yeah, and so we did this big national survey of the research priorities for people with disability. And one of the key areas of prioritization that people said was we need more research on the psychosocial impacts of disability. So so the mental health needs of people with disability. So it's that being something that, you know, that being an important priority for the community as well.
And just something that you said earlier in the conversation about, you know, how policy is created and recognizing, you know, how that is designed. And sometimes it's not always with the end user in mind. How can Manna, I guess, be better aware of those policy drivers? So the things that we do identify through our research, through our connections, through our learnt experiences to shape that policy, you know, how do researchers impact policy? When it's, I mean, often the time you think, oh, well, I'll create a paper and then I'm sure someone will read that and then that will help. But how do you actually help people join the dots from what you know, putting it into state or Commonwealth policy to have it trickling down in the right way?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely essential to do some cold calling of people working within bureaucracies and government bureaucracies, working out who the important people are to make, who are making decisions, but also to look at the important lobby groups that are out there. So in Australia, the Australian Psychosocial Alliance, which is a lobby group basically of large mental health providers, it's a lobby group that lobbies government, and it does it strategically. So as an academic, feeding into the work of those types of lobby groups, that's actually a way of getting your messages into government.
Right.
So I think making personal connections, but working out who are the groups that have the ear of government, I think is. So it's a bit of trying to map who's who. So that you
Yes, because
target.
it's such an important step. But even listening to you today, I was thinking, like, is it like watching an episode of Bewitched and just hoping that it trickles backwards over there and magically someone will go, well, Sarah's doing that work over there, that'll help it. And it doesn't happen like that. So I guess always reminding each other that we can't just expect people will come and knock on our door and say, heard you're doing great work, let's take that into account.
That's right. I mean, that absolutely has not happened in my experience. It's always been, who have I connected with? I have done the most beautiful papers imaginable on policy-related issues, but the things that make the difference are the reports that I've done in partnership with government.
Yes.
That someone has strategically sent to the right person in government that is for. So in 2018, we published the Mind the Gap report into psychosocial disability in the NDIS. Now that report, which we did from a fairly small grant, actually, it was only about 25,000, but it enabled us to do a bit of work that finally we had some data on the problems that were facing people with psychosocial disability. That our partner was Community Mental Health Australia, which is one of the national peak bodies working in Canberra. They had some really good connections to sitting Labor senators and Green senators. The Greens managed to get that report moved as a motion in Senate, and Labor supported it, the backbenchers supported it. So then it was passed as a motion, and then it could be used for questioning. But it was not, the research in that report was not any better than, you know, other research I'd done. It was probably maybe even a little worse, but it was those connections that made the difference.
I don't think you should devalue yourself like that, but it's a reminder that it doesn't have to sit in a Q1 journal in order for it to be the most impactful thing you can do in your career.
And also, the NDIS put out a 14-page rebuttal against that report.
So the takeaway is irritate people and cold call them.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, that was annoying because it meant I had to rebuild my relationship with the NDIA. Actually, I didn't really have a relationship beforehand. The reason why they were annoyed was because they didn't answer any of our emails, and then we decided to put the report out anyway, before they'd had a chance to see it. So, so I think it's, you need to be strategic in who you speak to, and also always have things open access. People need to be able to see what you've written.
So true, and make sure that even down to the ways in which you design the budget for your grant, all of those things are discrete but overt steps of access and inclusion for everybody. So repositioning, awesome. Okay, that's the end of my questions. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Jasleen, and she is going to co-create the question time.